Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Robert Hodges. I'm CEO of Altinity. It's my pleasure to welcome you to OSACon 2023. I'll be your host for our talk on open source and the state of licensing in 2023. It's my great pleasure to introduce three experts who are here today to talk about this topic. Let's start with Peter Zaitsev. Please introduce yourself and how you came to be in open source.
Okay, well, Peter Zaitsev, founder of Percona. Right before that, I was one of the early members of MySQL AV, if somebody remembers that company. I'm also advisor, founder, and investor in a variety of other open source projects, so projects supporting open source ecosystem. I'm not an open source zealot, but I think for sake of this panel, you can think about me as this radical open source advocate.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Heather, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks very much, Robert. I'm Heather Meeker. I'm a lawyer and a venture capitalist, and I specialize in open source software licensing in both respects. I have a private law practice, and I also am a general partner at OSS Capital, which is an early stage venture fund that only invests in commercial open source software development.
Wonderful. And Canis Qua, please
Yep.
introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Canis. I'm the VP of Product at a company called FOSSA. FOSSA is an open source management platform that helps companies perform open source license compliance. And I've been there for a while. Previously, I was at a company called Puppet for a long time that had a very, very vested interest in this very particular topic. And yeah, hope to share some thoughts from both companies.
Great. Okay, folks, here's what we're going to do. So we're going to dive into one of the really hot topics of this year in open source, which is relicensing. But I just want to say that we have this is structured in a way that we just want a good conversation, and we want to hear questions from you. So if you have interesting things you want to know about open source, just pop them into the Q&A. That's in the upper left in the little beside the little chat box. Post those questions. We'll be watching for them and try and feed them into the conversation and get you some answers. So with this, what I would like to do is kind of kick this off. By the way, folks, I'd like to welcome Roman Shaposhnik, who has just joined us. Roman, if you have audio, can you just go ahead and introduce yourself?
I believe I do. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes. It's perfect.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
Yeah, apologies. I was apparently on a different link. So, virtual conferences are still not my forte. But, I'm finally here. So my name is Roman, and I volunteer as VP of Legal Affairs at the Apache Software Foundation. I also happen to have a artificial intelligence company that I co-founded with a partner of mine called iNeco.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roman. This really completes the bill. All right. So hot topic, BSL, SSPL, and other non-OSI licenses. So a number of companies have relicensed their open source software this year. We don't need to give you names. You've probably seen them already, but we'd like to jump in. And I want to kick this off with a question starting with Heather. What are these licenses, and how do they change the meaning of open source, if in fact they do?
Well, so I think, we're referring to a category that's called source available licenses. That as a category is not nearly as settled a category as open source. But what you're seeing as a overall change in the last maybe 5 years or so is that companies who are trying to deploy a business model around open source have been moving some or all of their software into source available. A source available license it shares a lot of characteristics of open source software licenses, but it's not an open source software license. They are the same in that they generally allow you to access a source code. That's a baseline. They usually allow you to share and modify code and use the code, but they usually impose a license restriction that is supposed to be narrowly crafted to protect the business interests of the company that is releasing the software. And those usually are somewhere around either non-commercial, non-production use, or maybe don't use this to compete with us, or don't use this to compete with our software as a service offering. They're also deployed in what I'd call a frictionless way, which is no click to accept. It's just like within the software download, just like open source is. So they share some characteristics of open source, but they're not open source. And the last thing I would say is that they're really not a substitute for open source licenses. They're a substitute for proprietary licenses. So they're taking the proprietary category and making it more in line with the expectations of people in the tech world about how open source is deployed.
Great. That's a wonderful summary. I like the point that they're a substitute for proprietary licenses. That's a really good insight. So just what's the practical difference for users of open source? And I just invite anybody to jump in and sort of state your opinion.
Me.
There you go. Okay, Peter, open source
Okay,
radical.
yeah.
Go
Well,
for it.
I think this is kind of an interesting, right? And I think Hipper was saying interesting thing on one extent, saying, well, this is substitute for proprietary licenses. Completely agree, right? But I think the other claim, which I think many of those companies made, saying, well, these licenses are almost as good as open source, right? And I think this is completely off, right? If you think for the practical open source user, well, that goes in terms of your freedom, and that actually includes choosing a vendor, right? More than one vendor to choose from, right? If you only have one vendor, right, then you have to accept mediocre services at inflated prices, right? That is, like economics 101, right? If you guys know, right? So that is why you need that freedom. And then somebody tells you, oh, but it's just database as a service. But you know what? If you think in a database as a service space, database as a service is what really matters. That is what everybody is choosing, right? And I think a lot of those companies like to make that very misleading stuff, like, oh, guys, you know what? You have a complete freedom, except things that really matters. Right, that is, I think, the problem with those licenses, right? And I think a second thing, which is also the problem in many cases, is what there is, I think, attempts by many representatives from those companies, and I think maybe some folks they support to try to exactly this kind of redefine, oh, this is the new open source, or this is almost as good as open source, right? You can think, for example, MongoDB was very interesting, right? Because when they first introduced SSPL, right, they kind of yield the feedback saying, okay, we are source available license, we're not open source anymore. Now, if you go to their website, you can find is what they're claiming that the MongoDB is open source, right? It's open source. Well, it's just not OSI approved open source,
Okay,
right?
yeah, actually, I think that's accurate because when we wrote the SSPL, we specifically wrote it to meet the open source definition. The OSI didn't approve it, but OSI doesn't approve all open source licenses, so that's kind of a political question, actually.
Well, yeah, it's a political question, but I think in this case, like wherever you want it or not, right? I think there is a question: how do we call the real open source? You know what? Because I think there is a lot of users which want to understand what is real open source, not BSL, not SSPL, right? Where you can't, you have a practical, limitation.
I think it's also not just from the perspective of users, but also from the perspective of contributors, where contributors have entered into these projects, have bought into the vision of a lot of these open source projects on in some case their own definition of what open source means, and how they would be able to use it, what their contributions would be used for, and I think that that also comes into conflict when some of these projects start to change their licenses, and it starts to conflict with sort of what the contributors originally wanted to start contributing to the project. It goes against kind of their original intentions, and I think that's where the complication comes in with founders and companies trying to get started with these projects, and they need a group of people helping out and contributing, and then using that to then drive adoption. But then coming into conflict with some of the commercial interests in trying to turn it into a sustainable business?
Actually, I would like to quickly point out that even us on this panel, we already seem to be conflating two issues, here, which again, I'm as guilty as anybody else, because, on one hand, we talk about distribution properties and IP management of open source, which is typically covered by the license. But Kenneth, you just touched upon a subject that is basically governance, right? And yeah, in the open source, we're kind of in the situation of, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We try to basically use the only legal lever that we have, which is a license to regulate a lot of different things. But I actually feel that, governance is absolutely different from the IP management, right? And trying to conflate those two is really not a good idea. And the reason I'm pointing it out is it's actually on us, right? It's on the open source, community that we haven't really figured out, so how to even talk about those two things separately. We kind of, when we say open source, some people mean, just something that is available and I can use and I can legally download. Some people mean it's something that I can actually modify with a bunch of friends in the community. Two different things.
Yeah, I also think that I'm really glad you pointed that out, Roman, because there's licensing and there's governance and the protocols that people use for dealing with their community. And I think when people see license changes, they assume, rightly or wrongly, that means there's going to be a change in governance or the purpose of the project has changed or something like that. And I think that's where you get people that's what gets people really upset about license changes, is that they think the community isn't going to work like an open source community anymore. It sometimes goes beyond licenses. But I'll just say that the thing about the open source definition is it's only a definition of licenses. And so it's inherently a little bit limited. But when you start saying, well, this is under an open source license, but it's not real open source because the project doesn't run the right way, then you kind of get on a slippery slope where you have, people saying, well, I know how to run an open source project and you don't know how to run an open source project. And that makes for a lot of friction in the community.
Yep. Peter, I think you had a comment on governance.
Yeah. Well, so I think, I think that's a very important point to touch on, right, on their governance. I think this is indeed like when one of the problems with open source, it gets to be about the license, right? While if you think about the practical open source in terms of what its users or companies embedding open source or something looking for, it goes beyond that. And I think that is an unfortunate, right? What if you think like an only organizations like OSI we have in our space, they are focused on a license and license only, right? I think that is one of the problems why we are in this case. Like, for example, a recent Red Hat case. Well, yes, technically they did not violate the letter of the law, but hey, let's face it, they showed a finger to the large number of people. At least many people will interpret that this way, right? And I think another thing which is very interesting about the governance, right? What we saw, like especially with HashiCorp actions, HashiCorp was a darling, right? They did so many things right. Everybody in the community loved how they approach open source, and now, boom, they just go and do 180 degrees, right? What I think that means is what their trust to corporate entities is gone. There is none, right? Like even if a company has currently the open source license, what that means is what they are just getting for their turkey to be a little bit fatter before, bringing it to a Thanksgiving dinner, right, with a license change. That's all what we have to expect, right? And the real thing in this case is a governance, right? I mean, if you are looking for a long-term future of an open source, so far there is no other structure than their, non-profit governance.
Yeah, I would also point out that when you see license changes, particularly ones, or even governance changes, like the one that happened with Red Hat, a great example because it wasn't a license change, it was a governance change. That often happens when companies are in their late stages and they've either been acquired by other businesses or private equity interests that are no longer aligned with the open source mission. And so they start thinking, just like Peter, alluded to, how can we just monetize this thing we have as much as possible? And when they do that, they are often being short-sighted. They're not thinking about growing their community or serving their community anymore. They're just thinking about how to monetize the exact software that they have. So when I look at it, I think about it as a mistaken alignment between the owners of the company and probably what the original mission of the company was, to serve the community.
I want to just turn to the companies, because we're sort of bashing them a little bit here, but let's put ourselves in the shoes of a company that's up. We've seen this relicensing happening a number of times. It's a secular movement in some sense. So what are the forces that are driving companies to do this, and how do we think this is going to change the open source movement over time?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I mentioned, FOSSA is a company that does open source license compliance. But when I was at Puppet before, Puppet was very much a open core model. There was an open source Puppet project, and then there was a business built on top of it on a product called Puppet Enterprise. And that the tension there is, how do you actually monetize the enterprise bits? And how much of that, every time you, as a product manager, anytime you have a feature, does it go into the open source, platform, or does it go into the commercial enterprise offering? And there is a definite tension there that exists in order to both benefit the community and oftentimes leveraging community contributions, while at the same time trying to figure out, okay, what pieces of this business is specific to an enterprise offering that someone is willing to pay for. Puppet went through its own kind of relicensing. It went from GPL version 2 over to Apache 2.0. And I think it was Puppet 2.7, so fairly early on in the process. But a lot of that was based on trying to drive additional adoption and running into friction when having to convince people that the GPL in their case wasn't going to be a problem for them. But I think that those things are definitely in tension as you are trying to figure out, even in a very sustainable way, how to balance the interests of the community and the governance, of that community with commercial interests.
Yeah, it's also, taking the viewpoint of the companies. It's very well to say that a business should run an open source project for the benefit of the community. I actually think that's true as an investor, right? But on the other hand, you have to run it in a sustainable way. And what we're seeing across the board in open source software development is a real problem with sustainability. Like, people had a little bit of magical thinking going on about how open source projects would be sustained. And what it ended up doing is placing an enormous burden on the developers to work for free, basically. And so you're seeing a lot of projects that are running on shoestrings, they have security issues and so forth. And it's just that corporate, a corporation running a project is one way to fund the project, not the only way. But if that's the way that you're going to fund it, then as Canis mentioned, you have to, I don't look at it exactly as attention, but you have to have a balance, and you have to have the community feeding what the company's doing and the company feeding what the community is doing, and finding that balance can be extremely challenging.
Well, one thing I would say, I think is what's interesting to watch, right? I think many companies want to go and they say oh my gosh, we didn't know it's coming, right? Our hands enforced. There is no other way. I'm crying my bloody tears. I better have to do a license change. Well, guys, this is not the case, right? It's not just about the open source. A Silicon Valley approach, right, is often hey guys, you over servers, you get the market dominance, and then finally you start milking your cows, right? In this case, think about Uber. Didn't somebody notice what after they achieved market dominance, kind of rates went up? Don't you see the Google, which was some, don't be evil, right? And now I Google something and recently, typically nothing but the ads you see on the first front page. Over service, market dominance, and then you kind of focus on monetization, right? And changing the license as you got, close to saturation point is exactly what is those folks are doing, right? Why is HashiCorp doing that? Like, for example, well, think about that, right? Probably anybody who could use Terraform right now already knows and use about Terraform, right? They can't triple or 10x their market size anymore, right? Because everybody using Terraform. What they can do is to make 10 times people to pay, or people to make 10 times more, right? And that is why they're doing that. That is a very sensible thing to do for ruthless businesses.
Hey, Roman, I think you wanted to get something in, and go ahead. And then we got a couple user questions which I'd like to pull in.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly point out that, we keep talking about the corporations and sort of business models, right? But I feel that fundamentally the economics of the open source has still not been figured out. And this echoes, the comment that Heather just made. Corporation is a sort of what we expect the economy engine for the open source to be, but I don't think it's actually working in all, for all of the cases. Now, even for the corporations, we now take, this look that some companies can exist, not even as a service companies, but again, here's my favorite example, Voltron Data, right? It's a company that is basically sort of effectively working at the level of kind of fundamental building blocks. And their service is not really a product. They don't have just a single product. It's any kind of product that they can put out, combining those building blocks. It's a very innovative, very different way of thinking of how you can monetize open source, right? Also would love to point out that there are, projects like Tidelift, right, that are trying to figure out how can we incentivize and how can we maybe replace some of the corporate structure. I would love to see venture capitalists, doing a little bit more innovation. Obviously, there is OSS Capital, but even OSS Capital still takes the look that sort of the entity into which you invest as a corporation, where I would love to see the entities being sort of individual communities and figuring out the models how we can monetize that. Because I think fundamentally, until we have those types of incentives aligned, to Peter's point, we'll just have corporations do what corporations do. And we'll have, open source communities kind of stand by the side and say like, hey, that's just what happened. But that's kind of my last comment. When we say a community, we really need to mean a community. Because, I think what HashiCorp drama has shown us is that when HashiCorp was saying a community, it was sort of this double speak, right? Because on one hand, they wanted to really say that, well, we are the community. So if we change the license, you are beholden to them. And then a whole bunch of people showed up and said like, no, we are the community. You guys are just a small part of the community. Like your people working on your payroll is maybe like 1/10 of the people who would be able to support this thing, right? Now, again, because of the nice license, it was actually possible. Now we have open tofu. But sometimes we have open source projects which truly are just vendor driven. And if the vendor steps away, there is no community left. So again, we kind of need to really differentiate between all of those things in order to make meaningful statements about the economy of the open source and especially economy within a given community.
Yeah, let me jump in here because there's a user question that's directly relevant to this. So here it is from the infrastructure point of view, what OpenTofu is trying to pull off seems impressive and daunting. Can you speak to this and how likely in general it may be for an open source fork of a newly licensed BSL licensed tool to succeed? I think that's a great question.
I can maybe start because, I had a great sort of set of examples even before the OpenTofu. So OpenTofu just, got to be the biggest one. But even before that, at Apache, we have dealt with a lot of communities that basically coalesced around vendor-driven open source. Then vendor steps away, and the community has to find a home for their new project. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Obviously, OpenOffice is, one of those examples. Then we basically had, this whole thing around sort of a couple of other projects. And what it shows you is that a lot of times you really have a community that's sort of kind of in the shadows, right? But if there is an event that is a catalyzing event for that community, it steps out of the shadow. But then it sort of needs a home for it to exist. And a lot of times, if the license permits, Apache Software Foundation becomes that home. A lot of times, Linux Foundation becomes that home. But examples of when the community has shown up and said, like, no, we're ready to take over the project, and we don't need a vendor to basically support it. I mean, it's nice if the vendor exists, but it's not a prerequisite. There's a great example of those types of projects, and a lot of them are thriving.
I'm amused that you describe Linux Foundation as not being supported by vendors.
Well, I mean, the foundation itself is, but the communities within the Linux Foundation, I don't think if a single vendor steps away, the community will collapse, right? Take CNCF. Like, that is a very stable community. Even if a single vendor steps away, the project will, I am sure, continue, right? And most of the time, again, to me, that's the value that the foundations like Apache Foundation or Linux Foundation bring to the table. They're basically in business of validating that the community is still viable. In fact, again, at Apache, we have a process that, if a community becomes unviable, we move it to the attic, we signal that to the rest of the world. With a vendor, you never know whether the community is viable or not, because, as long as the business is still in business, the project will continue.
I'd also like to point out, I'm not sure I can think of an example, maybe you can, but with an open source license, the community can step away anytime it wants. It doesn't have to wait for a license change. It doesn't have to wait for a protocol change. And so it is kind of something that keeps the companies honest in a way. And when their interests start to diverge from their community, then the open source license gives the community the option to go a different direction. Yeah.
What I would also like to add in this case, I think the open tofu is kind of exactly a very good recent example, right? Is what, hey, the company does obviously hostile steps. We not only see the community coming together, but we have one of the respected foundations giving them home, right? Because I think in other cases, those things didn't happen, right? Like maybe for a variety of reasons, right? Like, for example, all the Red Hat alternatives are kind of doing that, started on their own, right? Mostly, right? Or you're thinking about like an, OpenSearch, right? I think it's still kind of thin on its own, right? Kind of doesn't have that any, well-known foundation backing. But I think that is fantastic, in this case, to see what we will see more people to understand what, hey, you can exercise your right to fork, which is fundamental to open source, right? Hey, guys, you don't like where vendor is going, boom, right? You can make your fork, right, and define your own future, which is fantastic.
And yeah, I think I'll just offer one thing from a product perspective, which is I'm an optimist when it comes to the open market of product, which is that I think going back to the question, what would it take for OpenTofu to thrive, is to build a better product than what the alternatives are. If they come in and they say, hey, all these things that have been sort of gated by maintainers of the Terraform community that we don't agree with, but actually demonstrate real value for those companies that are adopting it, to me, that's the best way for them to actually thrive, is to innovate.
I agree 100%. It's about having a great product that people can actually use and that they want to use. And if a company can do that, great. If they can't do it, then the community ought to take it over. But I also think that sometimes the communities might underestimate how much work is involved in making a product that's actually useful.
We are almost at the end. This has been a wonderful discussion. We've got about a minute and a half left. I want to give all of you a chance to make wrong predictions for 2024. So what do you see happening in licensing? What are the interesting things that you think that you're looking at for next year? Let's go roundtable, starting with Peter.
Oh, you want me? First? You want an absolutely ridiculous thing which doesn't happen? Well, okay, get it. Windows is going open source, right?
But seriously, no, because you can make, the point I'm making is that, people make predictions and they turn out to be wrong because the future is kind of hard.
Oh, okay. You want that that one.
What's your prediction for next year?
That's fine. You can go to the next one. I don't like to make predictions about future are hard, right?
Yes, they are, because it's the future. Heather, how about you? Anything you're looking at for next year that you think will be
Oh,
interesting?
I'll one up Peter and say, OpenAI will go open source.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
yeah,
even funny.
there we go.
That's even less likely, I think.
Yeah. Can I, Canis, what's
I
your?
think, I would say mine is that Microsoft becomes a new home for a lot of projects. I think that they have a model that actually is decoupling itself and enabling more open source to actually thrive. And I think that a lot of things will thrive under their broad governance.
Roman, any predictions from you?
Yeah, my prediction, I guess, is going to be OSI is going to come out with the full functional definition of open source AI, and everybody is going to agree to that.
That may be even less likely.
Okay, yeah.
Great. All right. So we've had 4 crazy predictions, and we're at the end of the talk. I'd like to thank all 4 of you. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.